All right, welcome back to another episode of the Real Edge podcast. Mark, good to see you. We're joined today by Brian Vieaux of FinLocker. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Happy New Year, guys.
You as
Happy
well,
New Year to you
Brian.
too.
Welcome.
Mark, one of the things that comes up whenever we jump on these podcasts, whether we're talking to our colleagues in the industry, professional athletes, one of the things that comes up is competition. And I thought, what a better place to start with Brian than we work in a highly competitive industry, but we also collaborate. We are an industry. We've got to advocate for things. We have a lot of the similar interests when it comes to what the trade association does or what can benefit our companies nationally. But then we get in the trenches and we got to win business. And so with both of you guys on here today, I just wanted to start there. We've got, we're talking football playoffs beginning this week. We got college football now. So it's hard to avoid sports analogies when you're talking business or you're talking competition. So I'll do my best to restrain myself on the sports analogies today. But Brian, you do a lot of content on collaboration, partnerships, working together. Can you talk a little bit about how you then think about competing as well with the same people you might collaborate with the day before or the day after? Kind of
Yeah.
talk us through your mindset today, and then we'll dig into some of your background as well.
Yeah. So, in today's world, um, I would say for the most part, the collaboration is authentic and it's genuine and it's for the good of the whole, right? Whether
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yep.
whether that's industry or it's the consumers that we all serve at the end of the day. But let's just be honest that we do this content, right? We do these talks, not just to hear ourselves talk, but to build the brand, either our personal brand or the company brand or some combination thereof. And we do that with the idea that we want to win, whatever winning looks like, right? And so, um, I think that in my world today, with FinLocker in particular, and what our product does, there are some competitors, like direct competitors, not very many, but there's people coming into the space for sure. But what I find interesting is when I think about who I'm competing against in a particular lender shop, it's not about somebody else that does what we do. It ends up becoming more of I'm competing against this finite budget that the lender
Mm-hmm.
has for their tech stack. And I was a lender. I sat on that side of the table, so I get it. And so for me, it really becomes a matter of where I have to show enough value in our product that this lender will remove something else from their stack to make room economically for my product. And I don't always know who I'm competing against. Now, a lot of cases I never know. And
Mm-hmm.
so that makes it really interesting when you try to position your product, your service, the value that you bring when you're in my case, when I don't necessarily know who I'm up against.
Yeah, Mark, what do you say to that? Like competing against your other companies that are directly trying to steal your business versus competing against something like the lender's attention or the status quo or whatever budget cycle we're in. How do you look at it when you think about it for Silk Title?
I've come at it very similar. I mean, I ironically was just on a phone with a competitor of ours before this podcast, and the industry's so big, but it's actually so small, right? And the reality is good competitors can still gain the same market share by collaborating and doing things where the industry needs to go. And when you start looking at it, it's kind of like all of us are competitive by nature, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're in the levels that we're at, we're always competitive. So it's always tough because I'll use the football analogy. If you get to the Super Bowl, you're the two best friggin' teams in the NFL. You should be proud of that, but people only remember the one that wins,
That's
right?
right.
And it's kind of an interesting thing. You're like, okay, like the players are making a ton of money. The coaches are making a ton of money. It's interesting because I always use the Pepsi and Coke thing where it's like, it's not bad to be Pepsi until you're in the Super Bowl, right? Then it's pretty bad to be Pepsi because you want to be the Coke and you want to have the Super Bowl championship. So the reality of it is both teams still make money, but is it really about making the money all the time, or is it really about the change in winning? And I think you juggle that a lot in seats like ours, which is you want to win so bad, but you got to realize sometimes just getting to the ship makes it a win too, and you got to evaluate what your wins are, because years ago maybe you weren't an actual team that could even make it there, right? And you got to evaluate and I said it yesterday in your podcast too, Jeremy, which is, to win the war you got to win the battle, right? And in order to actually get to the Super Bowl, you actually got to be one of the two best teams in the league. Therefore, it's not that you suck, it's just that you didn't win, and being a competitor, it's tough, right? But I think a lot of people who go to the Super Bowl learn that, right? And they learn that if you look at it, yes, it sucks to lose, but look at the way the camaraderie is even after the game. And yes, you get the pain of losing, but there's still a respect that those two teams have for each other just by making it there. And I think if our industry actually started looking at that like that a little bit more differently and saying, okay, it's okay to actually be competitors, but working together to revolutionize. And that's why I feel the industry is coming today, is that it's time for the change. And in order to do that, instead of always competing and trying to cut each other's off the knees, it's actually better to be partners in this and realize there is enough business, and you both made it to the Super Bowl, so you're still very viable companies.
Right.
I could be wrong, but that's how I viewed this over the last 24, 36 months.
Yeah, Brian, you mentioned going back and having been a lender, running origination and production, as well as now being a technology leader. Can you talk about what Mark just said, going back even further? Have you seen it change? Have you seen it change from then till now? And sort of what are you drawing from that about either the industry or about what we can look forward to in the next year?
Yeah, I don't know if it's change as much as what I do see today, which I saw 5 years ago, was a segment of the market, a segment of the players in the market that have always been collaborative to a certain degree, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's always been a handful of players in the market. We're in Detroit, so two of them might happen to be pretty close to us right now.
Where we are.
And Jeremy may have for one.
Yeah.
That, at least to each other, they're definitely not collaborative. I'm not sure that they ever will be. And at least one of them is generally not overly collaborative with the rest of the industry. And so I think if we can take away a few of the players and then think about kind of the, call it numbers 3, 4, or 5, 6 down, then I think there's definitely there tends to be more collaboration. And then even, where the rubber meets the road in our business is on the street, right? It's really where the loans are getting originated. And then that's the loan officer, the individual loan officer typically that's driving that. And that's where I probably see more collaboration is across the loan officer community. And I see that in the form of these coaching communities where loan officers from, that are wearing different jerseys, right? To go back to the sports analogy, are in the same coaching community. And they're truly masterminding, and some of them are in the same markets. And so it's interesting to me to see that dynamic where really the street level is where the competition happens and where the wins happen. And I feel like I see more kind of collaboration there than I see anywhere else.
That's an interesting point, because one thing that you think about is, from our seat, you always try and look at it from, try and get to the decision maker. But you actually got to listen to the line level to understand what the decision is going to be. And I think a lot of people just go after what they perceive as an SVP, EVP, and higher. And it's like, yes, they may be the final decision maker, but there's a huge amount of team underneath that you got to understand their pain points. And if you listen to that side of it, it actually allows you to bring in what it is that they're desiring to do. And you can actually bring your product to life better than if you're always just listening to, okay, this is our initiative. The problem with it is in the world we live in is everybody has an initiative, but they don't really know how to execute on that initiative, and they don't listen as well as they probably should to understand what the pain point is, right? And in this market right now with the consolidation and the amount of LOs going out of the business, now it's the cream's starting to rise to the top there a little bit, and you got to really even listen more because it's no longer a bitch session. It's about what do I really need because these people have survived this, right? And the bitch session was, I couldn't do it. And there's that 25% that's out there that has no longer there. Now it's even higher. And if you're not a company listening, you're gonna have the challenge. You could have the best product in the world. It's how you implement it and how you bring it to market.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And when we went to market, for the first time we went to market with our current version of our product, this consumer financial fitness experience, our focus was at the C-suite and aligning with initiatives. And we struggled with adoption because adoption has to happen at the street level where the consumer is, and the consumer is where the loan officer is, and vice versa. And so about 18 months ago, it became very, very, very obvious to us that yes, we had to sell at the enterprise level, but then we had to sell again down to the user level. And so we shifted our initial focus differently and started talking more often with the street level, with the producers, which allowed us to assess, as we were going, assess any product enhancements and tweaks that we needed to make. And so I think for the companies that are out there, depending on your product and your service, if at the end of the day, if you're reliant on, in this case, loan officers to really be your enablement, then start there and listen there first before you put a lot of work into the product, because you're going to end up having to undo and redo stuff.
And Jeremy, it's a good point too, because we looked at it where a lot of ops and underwriting was more on our side of it because, we were listening to the LOs on the pricing and everything, but on our side of it, you got to look at the operational side of it because that's where the road meets the road to get it to closing, right? Yeah. So we had to listen to that processor, listen to that team of, okay, where are those pain points? Because at the end of the day, they're the mouthpiece to tell the LO who's a great title company or who's a great partner, right? So understanding how decisions are made, everyone thinks it's coming always from the top. And yes, final decisions are probably coming from the top, but a lot of times in a lot of companies, that top is so disengaged with what's going on down here and the pain points. They have that vision, they have their roadmap, especially going into like a new year like now. Here's my roadmap, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to gain business, here's how we're going to gain market share. That's all great, but then you also got to listen to the people that are actually doing it and producing this in order for it to be successful. And I think there's a gap in that a lot of times. And one of the things I learned over the last few years too is, you look at it where a lot of these mortgage companies and title companies and everything, you want to give the entrepreneurial feel to that loan officer. Well, if you're doing that, you got to listen to them because they think that they're being given that idea that they're running their own little business there. Well, if you're going to really do that, you got to do it in all facets. You can't just do it as saying, okay, well, run your own business from your commission standpoint. You got to run your own business then and work together with how do they have success in order to receive the outcome, which is that commission and their success monetarily.
Yeah, I think you've identified one of the major pain points I hear from startups and new technology companies trying to get in the business, which is really understanding what that hard work of mapping an organization feels like. How do I find my champion? How do I find who influences it? How do I find who's the actual signatory on the agreement that I ultimately need? And I think we often underestimate how those decisions get made internally. One of the things, at least one of the trends we're seeing on the consumer side, is that personality-driven companies, people-driven companies, the face of the company, is having a lot more influence at scale than ever before. So we're seeing like the figurehead of a company drive revenue, drive customers, drive engagement. And in a lot of cases, there's some like really extreme examples where like Elon Musk represents more about Tesla than the car does in many cases. And do you see any of that trickling in as a threat? Because what you just described has always been true of our business. It's a people-driven business. It's a relationship-driven business. It's a referral network. You got to do the hard work of earning trust and mapping it. Do you see that technology is giving people, for lack of a better way to put this, a chance to scale personality, to scale people, so that there's actually a threat to that local network, that local person, because you can now kind of get the personality of a brand out there more? How do you see that affecting differentiation now more so than ever before?
So it's interesting because I actually, as you were talking, I was going down a different path, but
yeah, tell me.
I'll start where I was going and then try to kind of tie it back. Actually, like today, when I think about our technology and what we're serving, what we're trying to do to help loan officers scale their ability to serve more consumers who are in a certain state, and that state is not yet ready to transact. We present ourselves as this technology that allows you to leverage your physical and digital brand, loan officer, and your digital and physical personality in your community, again, digital and physical. And so in that regard, they are the rainmaker, right? And our technology allows them to, where they may have only been able to do this for a population of 40 consumers or 20 consumers, using a platform like ours, now they can scale and have hundreds of consumers in this kind of evergreen, getting ready state. And so we talk a lot about enabling and empowering that local street level loan officer with technology that allows them to compete with some of the biggest brands in their technology and how consumers expect a certain, UI, UX. And so I think it's different than where you were going. What I don't see today is as I look at the landscape of mortgage lenders, primarily IMBs, I don't know that I could point to any one and say that's the personality of the company. Maybe definitely in a B2B sense, if we're talking about like TPO shops, but
sure,
I don't see a single company out there that is I mean, even our guys here. I mean, we used to have, David Hall, and we had who was the Jay Farner, and then before
Jay
that,
Farner, yeah.
way back when, it was before David Hall. I can't think of the name, but that was the personality that we saw and heard all across TV and radio that drove consumers in. I don't see any lenders doing that at the logo level. I see LOs doing it at the local level.
Yeah, you're right. It was two sides of the same coin, because what I was suggesting might be a threat, you're saying is an opportunity, where if we don't think a national brand is going to step up or step in with a person or personality the way I'm describing it, then the opportunity is, how do you scale your biggest producers? To Mark's point, the consolidation we always predicted, or that I always heard predicted, was the thought, at least going back, I'll say as far as like 2018, it was, we're going to lose these small and mid-sized companies. What we're actually seeing, I think, is the bottom third of producers at each company. So whether you have 15 loan officers or 1,500 loan officers, it's actually the bottom third of the 5, or the bottom third of the 1,500 that are leaving, rather than the company getting consolidated in many cases. And I think that's a little bit different than the consolidation that was or has been predicted. Mark, what do you see when it comes to like differentiation then in that world, especially from a business based on like hooking in from a technology perspective and then having the relationships on top of it? How do you see this effect that we need to drive to trends? We need to be on top of what's cutting edge from both a technology and a personality brand perspective. How are you starting to project differentiation in that world?
Well, it's really a good question. Brian hit the nail on the head. I think the reality of it is, and I'll use Rocket as an example. Like, Rocket does a great job of driving the consumer to them. Then it's the LO's job. So you got two personalities. You got, hey, we need to get the business in the door first. Then you got the interesting thing that's going to come up, and data is going to come into this. You can actually take the data and take that persona of that borrower and link it to the right LO based off of attributes. And if you do that properly, now all of a sudden the main brand of Rocket drives the consumer to Rocket, and then it's the individual's job to then align with that consumer to keep that consumer in your funnel, right? Where do most companies fail? They fail to keep the consumer in the funnel, right? Like, and it doesn't matter if you're consumer direct shop, it doesn't matter if you're retail, they fail to keep the consumer engaged with them through the cycle journey, right? And say, okay, how do we get them to their end result? And that's where everyone's so concerned even over the trigger leads, right? Like the reason why they're concerned about it is the loss of business. It's not because the trigger lead is a bad thing. And the funny thing is you see all this stuff out there right now. And the reality in the trigger lead side of it is if you think that Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion don't already have the solution to that, CFPB just came out and sued them today. Do you think the big three are really going to be like, yeah, we're going to let go of some of our largest revenue? No, they're already looking at the alternatives to it, right? So instead of worrying about the competition and what the triggered, let's worry about how do you retain your funnel, right? And I think that's a bigger P. I think a lot of people start worrying about the wrong things. And to me, let's worry about how do you change what's happening and understand the why. Why did that person leave? Like, why did they leave your ecosystem by being triggered by somebody else? And it's not rate. Like, everyone's so consumed on the rate. Like, in this day and age, it's rate is the rate is the rate. Like, if you're that far off, it's easy to justify, right? But people aren't that far off. The reason why somebody leaves is because they didn't tell her what the process is going to be like. It took too long. They thought it was getting closed at this time. It didn't get closed at this time. They didn't tell them what the cash out was, didn't tell them what other fees could be in there. The original CD of the disclosure ends up being a little bit different. So that triggers them going somewhere else. It's not a trigger pull on a payoff, right? That's going to happen. It's really likability and relationship. And I think where if you take this persona and said, okay, company's role is to drive the consumer into the ecosystem, but then it's the individual to keep the consumer in the ecosystem and close. Right? You see it very well on the servicing side, right? Like, why is everybody buying the servicing rights? Because they want the consumer data, right? And they understand that why is Mr. Cooper doing what they do? Because they want to know they have that consumer locked in and they know that attribute, right? It ain't about rate. It's about experience, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, I like differentiating on experience because that makes data simply a subset of the experience, either a tool or an avenue or a way that you use it, rather than what I think a lot of people say, Mark, or maybe a lot of people get wrong in what you just said, is making data itself the differentiator. Yeah. And I think we've all agreed, said enough that it's not. It's how you use it.
Jeremy, look what Brian has. I mean, I would bet you if the lender used the data more effectively and really focused on streamlining their process, they'd close more loans, right? The other thing too is they don't nature the person when it is denied because of one thing. They say, oh, not a loan. The loan officer moves on to something else. Do you know how much data is sitting in mortgage companies of loans that didn't close that could really, if nurtured properly and manage the data properly, those attributes change over time. People's situation change over time. So instead of having to go acquire that same lead again or a different lead, why are people not nurturing their own pipeline the way it should be? And if you look at where the biggest revenue pieces that people are missing out, it's the thousands upon thousands of leads that they've had.
You must have been listening to one of my calls today. I had a lender tell me today that in 2024, they issued somewhere around 11,000 pre-approvals and closed somewhere south of 3,000 loans.
So what? Now you have 9,000 leads. You're telling me you couldn't do something with 9,000 and even get 1,000 of those leads to close in 12 months and coach that borrower as to what to do? That's the biggest opportunity in the mortgage space, in my opinion.
Agreed.
So I love that because that's the headline for me is like, we talk a lot about advice, mindset, all these different things. This feels to me like a very specific thing. So, Brian, let me put it back on your experience with what Mark asked. Why is it so hard? Why is this so hard for lenders? I mean, if I was sitting in a lender I often had my hand up. Let me work on it. Let me work on that. I wanted to find the problems that were the most valuable. Is it something about sort of institutional silos? Is it something about the difficulty getting access and visibility to the right people? Can you talk a little bit about, as specifically as you can, at least, about what tends to hold people back?
Yeah, I think we have to look at it. You almost have to look at it from a transaction type perspective, purchase versus refi, because they're two separate animals, right? And so on the purchase side, anyway, it's still very, very local or distributed loan ops or whatever you want to call it. Even some of the biggest brands that have been stood up to be 100% digital experience are actively hiring and bringing in big teams of distributed local loan officer. Why are they doing that? Because that's what it takes to win that business. So if we isolate on the purchase side for a minute, I think we've done this to ourselves as an industry by creating this compensation model for the loan officer where they're 100% commission. And that
instant gratification.
That commission only happens when they close loans. And so if you have 10 consumers hit a loan officer's storefront, digital or physical, and 7 of them are ready to transact, three need some massaging and hand-holding and some nurturing over time. Most LOs are going to just kick the 3 to the curb, focus on the 7, and then get on to the next 10 new ones. And that cycle repeats and repeats and repeats. And so at the individual level, they're just not going to change their behavior, because at the end of the day, they eat what they kill. And when times are tough, there's fewer things to kill. So I think that's a fundamental challenge that the industry has and will continue to have as long as that's the model. There's some thoughts on how to solve it at the enterprise level. But it's going to take, ultimately, it would require that loan officer, if they truly were going to be hands off on those 3 out of 10 that aren't ready to transact, it's going to take that loan officer being willing to hand that back to this nurture division or strategy or initiative. And then when it does close, agree to being compensated differently because of the work that went into getting it to closing. So, I think there's some opportunities there. And I'm seeing a few companies kind of play with that model, but it's not, no one's doing it at scale right now.
Well, I think one of the things that has always plagued the ability to change into something that flexible is that each of those groups specialize or use technology that wasn't necessarily always consistent. How you deal with a real estate agent, how you deal with point of sale, how you deal with a purchase flow versus refi versus all that. And I think you're right. The more, if I was thinking about it from a mortgage lender's perspective, the more you can keep the infrastructure consistent and build smaller, more flexible teams around those use cases, we actually might see what Rocket was working on 10 years ago, which was individual tasks get shot off to individual units. In the next 10 years, it's actually customers get pushed into those smaller groups that are built to solve that customer's problem rather than tasks. So I really like this idea. At least I'm innovating it on the spot, I suppose. But just like, how do you do that? How do you get a customer to the right sort of pod that knows how to solve that customer's problem, but everybody's using the same infrastructure? Everybody's using scale. That to me is a much more interesting problem to solve if I was a mortgage lender.
Well, what's interesting too is, and no one wants to answer this, is like there's still been purchase business over the last 3 years. Yeah. And do you know how many of those people need to pull the equity back out of their house because they They blew it all. They blew their entire savings to buy the house, right? And now they now own a house and they have issues, right? They have stuff they got to go spend money on, right? And people don't realize that that 20% really is now 30% because of appreciation or whatever was happening. And, people aren't getting outside the box. They really have this one trick pony way of doing it, and they're not thinking and being creative and utilizing data to understand it, right? And I think if people started doing that, and again, maybe you're a 620 credit score, but you need to be 680. Okay, well, what can we do to get there, right? And it doesn't need you don't always need to go to credit repair company, right? Like a good loan officer knows what you need to do. Credit utilization is one of the biggest issues, right? Okay, just get your credit utilization under 30%, and here you go. Your score just went to 680, and you now just qualified, right? The problem is people aren't taking that time. And Brian, you brought up a good point, which is, okay, your loan officer's typical ADHD. They're just in it for the minute right now. Well, what if you took that and you took some of your money that you made on that loan and you had, I don't even want to call it a retention team. You had a team that was there that not compensated the same way, but they're there to nurture the borrower to get it, and then they kick it back. And yes, that loan officer is not going to make the same commission as they would if they hunted and gathered it out of the gate, but you split that commission or you do something where it makes sense. Now the company benefits and the loan officer benefits. And now you have a team that they're not your typical loan officer. They're a team that has more time, wants to take more time, and they're compensated not to cold call. They're compensated not to build a relationship. They're compensated to build a relationship after you got them in the door. Because there's a lot of people that don't like the cold calling aspect of it. There's a lot of people that don't like the hunting and gathering aspect of it, but they are good salespeople, right? They can sell. They just don't like that aspect of selling. So create the mousetrap that allows you to do that and understand it goes back to the statement that Brian made earlier, which is you only have so much money on tax, so you got to try and convince people. Well, if you only have so much revenue, also understand, okay, take that bottom feeder loan officer. Maybe they're not a bad loan officer. Maybe they just don't like cold calling. Maybe they don't like the art of of hunting and gathering. Well, maybe that person can go over here, and so what? You pay them a $50,000 base salary, but they are nurturing because they are that type of person, and they make you $1 million, right? Yeah. So they cost you 50. People aren't thinking like that right now because it's just stuck in the same way we've always done it.
Yeah.
One of the things that you reminded me of was this competition quote that I used to use a lot in my innovation teams and my strategy teams, which was from the CEO of SoulCycle, when they asked her, how do you compete with, whether it's at the time CrossFit or P90X, and now increasingly you've got all the different spinning, rowing, boxing, all the different things. How do you think about competing? And she said kind of what Brian said earlier, which is, I actually compete with Netflix, because if you're on your couch, you're not moving around, and I need you moving around. So I don't think about competing with other styles of exercise. I'm competing with getting you off the couch. And then once you're off the couch, I get a greater share of business. And I think that reminded me of how we're talking here about competition and differentiation. So I really appreciate that. To me, this is, one of the more practical ways that we can tell our audience to be approaching their business either in this coming year or future. Any closing thoughts, Brian, from what we talked about on your advice to your potential business partners, lenders out there competing in this way?
Yeah, I would use your the SoulCycle story there, because it's the same for loan officers, right? As a loan officer in your market, you compete with other loan officers, no question. What you have the opportunity to win with is getting to consumers in your community, again, physical or digital, as early as possible in their financial life, and start to build a relationship that's centered on financial education, financial preparation, with home ownership as the objective. And yes, it's a long game. Yes, you're going to have to invest time, money, effort into this long game. And maybe it's going to be 30% of your time that has to go to this strategy. But imagine if you started doing that 5 years ago, what your business would look like today with all those people that you've built this 5-year relationship with. Do you think they're going to go price you, go choose another lender over an eighth in rate? Not a chance. So
right.
The opportunity's there for everybody. And, instead of Netflix, it's you gotta kind of, I'm not telling you to get off the realtor referral model, because that's still very viable, but go find an opportunity to have a true direct source of incoming business and leads that are going to have a long tail to nurture, because you can win there, and you can win for a long time.
The hybrid model is going to be where it's going to come to, right? It's going to have to, because the data that's out there is going to force that hybrid model. And I couldn't agree with Brian more. And at the end of the day, think about it. If you go back to some of the sports analogies, how many players stay on the same team forever?
Right.
Right. How many times do they suck at one side of it and then go somewhere else and they break out in banner year? Right. And I think what everybody's got to start looking at is, it's okay not to think the same way anymore. It's okay to go against the grain. It's okay to go against what everybody's been doing, because that's the definition of insanity. And what we're going to start seeing is what people are doing are not going to continue to keep up. It's what happened with Blockbuster and Netflix, right? And there's going to be the same paradigm shift in the mortgage industry. And the other thing too is, a digital experience does not mean no relationship. And I think that's where people are starting to get this wrong, which is a digital experience just means it's coming in a different way. It still requires a human being to continue to nurture that relationship. It's not going to be click button, get mortgage, right? We're not there just yet. And it would be and because of the asset and how large of the transaction is, will it ever get there? I don't know. Maybe it does, but we're not there yet. So realize where we are today, realize what it means, and how do you get there if that's what your goal is, but realize you still got to deal with the now. And digital just means how you're bringing that consumer and the experience they're having through that journey. It doesn't mean the relationship means no human interaction. And you got to understand your consumer too, of, okay, that consumer wants more interaction than this consumer. This consumer wants more interaction, but they want it through digital transformation. This consumer wants the phone call. This consumer wants this. But that goes back to taking the attribute of that consumer and linking them to the right loan officer and understanding that, right? So I think that is where we are starting to see the paradigm shift. And Brian, you said it, there is a hybrid coming, and you can't just be a one-trick pony. You got to have both facets going at the same time, and realizing if you do that too, your pipeline's actually getting larger, and you got to continue to nurture that pipeline through the journey. What people don't realize is a loan is a journey, right? And the journey experience, if you manage that journey properly, you're going to even have more business with better outcomes and a better experience.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end on that, Mark, because you can wait to see what the future looks like and try to adapt to it, or you can create the future and make everyone else adapt to it. And I think what we've just laid out, what Brian said, what you just said, is the edge that companies need to say, you know what, I'm just going to push forward because I believe in this. I believe this is the future. I'll make everyone else follow me. And that's sort of the takeaway I'm hearing on competition and differentiation. So I appreciate it. Thank you both for being here. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of Real Edge, and we'll be back again soon.
Thanks, guys.